Welcome. It is Mitch. I'm on YouTube. If you haven't already, please, you know what I'm going to say. You know what I'm going to say. Click the subscribe button. You can even click it in the bottom right corner. Try to build this channel up. Today's video, Packers-Jaguars, final thoughts. Packers heading to Florida this weekend. Different temperature change you would think, but last week's game against Houston at Lambeau was pretty hot for a middle of October game. Also, I'm going to try to say Jacksonville when referencing who Green Bay is playing this weekend as much as I can, because I think I'm one of those weird people who can't say Jaguars, or when I say it, I feel like I'm saying it incorrectly. Jaguars. So I'm going to say Jacksonville as much as possible. Otherwise, I'm going to get inside my own mind. So it's Green Bay, Jacksonville. Final thoughts is how we'll phrase it. And this is a classic. I said it earlier this week in a video. It's a classic don't play with your food game if you're Green Bay. I know this is a popular spot for people to just scream trap game at the top of their lungs with a big matchup against Detroit looming in 2 weeks for Green Bay. But I also think sometimes we just fall prisoner to looking for those spots. Like, is Green Bay playing like a team right now that's going to fall for a trap game? I don't think they are. They're coming off a huge win against Houston, and you sandwich this Jacksonville game between C.J. Stroud and the Texans and Jared Goff in Detroit, and it's easy to scream trap game for Green Bay. But they're coming off a matchup where they beat Houston, but I would say they played at like a C+. It was a sloppy game. There were plenty of mistakes, penalties. They lost the turnover battle 3-0 and still escaped with a win. And you take the wins however you can get them. But I'd be more concerned and perhaps more obligated to also scream trap game with those who feel that that's what this Sunday is. If Green Bay played lights out and stellar against Houston and they were feeling themselves and they were riding a high coming off that game against the Texans where they won by like 17, and then they looked at Jacksonville and they're like, oh, this is going to be easy pickings, and then we'll come back and really get ready for this Detroit game. I don't think Green Bay is playing or acting like a team that's going to fall for a trap game, at least at this point in the season. I don't. And I can't tell you how many buddies have texted me this week and have said, oh, man, this feels like a trap game. I'm terrified. Like, Green Bay could lose to Jacksonville, but I would say, especially on paper and with the eyes, what we've seen, and I've only seen 2 Jacksonville games this year out of their 7, Green Bay is a far superior team. Like, I think there's a pretty wide margin between what the Packers are at this moment and what Jacksonville is coming back after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it was, in London for a pair of games where they split, lost to the Bears, and beat the Patriots. So I get that it's kind of just normal to look at the schedule, and then as things unfold, you find those spots where it's like, oh, Green Bay should win this game, but it feels like a trap. I just don't think they have that mindset right now where I'm worried about that. And you have Matt LaFleur at his pressers this week. He's saying all the right things. He said, oh, this is a team that's lost games by 3, 4, and 5 points. Matt LaFleur said in his presser on Wednesday, he said, this team could be 5-2. They're 2-5, but they're 5-2. He also said they have players at all levels, and this is a really good team. So Matt LaFleur is doing exactly what he should be doing. He's saying all the right stuff, but we can call it like it is, because I'm not the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, so I'm not giving Jacksonville any bulletin board material by saying how I feel and saying really probably what many of you are thinking. This is not a good Jacksonville team. It is not. They started 0-4. The defense has been woeful in many categories. We'll get to that in a second. They don't strike that fear into you. They have games where it's so lopsided, you just wonder, like, how did it get to this point? They got blown out by Buffalo, and I get a lot of teams are going to get blown out by the Bills this year, but it was so ugly. And then their first game in London, they were playing catch-up with Chicago by like 2 possessions the entire game, never caught up, and the Bears won going away before Jacksonville rebounded a week ago and took out the New England Patriots. So I don't think this is a trap spot. Matt LaFleur is saying everything he really needs to be saying. And here are some of the numbers that, to me, really matter, and they kind of illuminate where the Packers could really butter their bread in this matchup on Sunday. Jacksonville is dead last in blitz rate at 16%. Now, you can look around and say, hey, defenses can have success without blitzing. I get that. The reason I bring it up is that there has been no quarterback in the National Football League that has been blitzed more than Jordan Love since the beginning of last year. Why do I span it out to the beginning of last year? Well, Jordan Love's a 2-year starter. His first start as QB1 for Green Bay came last year. So since he took over for Aaron Rodgers as the starting quarterback for the Packers, no quarterback's been blitzed more than J. Love. And that blitz percentage averages out to 36% per game. So you're talking about a 20% dip because Jacksonville blitzes about 16% of the time per game this year. They're 25th in sack percentage. I mentioned a defensive coordinator's dream scenario is being able to get pressure in hurries and rushes of a quarterback and sacks just rushing 4. That's a dream scenario for a defensive coordinator if you don't have to bring extra bodies and you're still making things miserable for an opposing quarterback. Well, Jacksonville doesn't blitz 32 out of 32 teams. And so you go down to that next category and you're like, well, are they able to get pressure on the quarterback? Are they getting all the way home? Not really. 25th in sack percentage. They're 30th in scoring defense. The defense has been a sieve at times for the Jaguars, and I said it there instead of Jacksonville. And they're 31st in passing yards allowed per game. I know I threw a lot of numbers your way. If you want to ball it all together, not a good defense. And it's a defense that is especially vulnerable in the opposing team's air attack. And I look at Jordan Love. I look at this array of weapons. I look at what's a pretty healthy group. Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, Tucker Kraft, obviously Musgrave's out. And I think this is a matchup where Jordan Love, Matt LaFleur, and the Packers offense are licking their chops and probably breaking down the tape and seeing a bevy of different options where they can attack Jacksonville through the air. Because it's, like I said, dead last in blitz rate. That tells me Jordan Love, isn't going to see a lot of, extra bodies coming his way. He's going to have to really solve the riddle at the line of scrimmage. But even if teams aren't blitzing, they can still get home. Not Jacksonville. 25th in sack percentage, 30th in scoring defense. They give up a ton of points, 31st in passing yards allowed per game. And if you're worried about the interceptions, right, that's like the last category right now for Jordan Love. Some people are like, man, he's got 8 interceptions and he missed 2 games this year, so he's throwing picks at a pretty alarming rate. I get that. Some of the concern, I guess, is valid. I think it'll be kind of washed away and they'll get it under control. But if you're worried about that for this weekend, Jacksonville's 29th in takeaways. Like, every single thing Jacksonville could try to exploit with the Packers offense to try to slow them down or really bring things to a halt, they just don't do well as a defense. They give up a ton of yards, a ton of points. They don't blitz. They don't get to the quarterback, and they don't generate takeaways. So all those things, like if you're worried about Jordan Love being blitzed because no quarterback's been blitzed more than him, probably won't have to worry about that this weekend. If you're worried about takeaways because we saw 2 more interceptions from Jordan Love last week against Houston, even though Green Bay won, Jacksonville's 29th in takeaways. Like all these, if you want to call them weaknesses or things that need to be addressed for the Packers or things they see often, like Love facing the blitz, Jacksonville doesn't do it. They just don't. Like 3 guys this week that I'm buying all the stock in: Jordan Love, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed. This seems like one of those prime games where it seems like there's stretches where Christian Watson just isn't, and it's not his fault, but he just isn't involved. Like he'll go 2 or 3 weeks and he'll have like 5 targets and they'll try to get him involved in some jet sweep action and it just doesn't come to fruition. And it feels like he's maybe in one of those ruts outside of that long touchdown connection against Arizona. It's been a quiet little stretch for Christian Watson. I think this is a prime matchup for Matt LaFleur to really game plan to get Christian Watson involved. And then Jaden Reed. I think if there's one guy that can be the top dog for this wide receiver group, not saying they need a top dog in this group, but if there is one, to me, it's Reed. He's had a quiet couple of weeks against Arizona. I know he had a touchdown against them, a short one. And then last week, very quiet in the win over Houston, and you kind of just tip your cap to the Texans defense in some respects because Green Bay found success with a touchdown to Wicks, and Romeo Doubs had like 8 catches for 94 yards or something like that. But those are the 3 I'm buying stock in. I mean, I'm loading up my stock on Love, Watson, and Reed. I think that trio goes bananas this week against Jacksonville. And if Jacksonville is to win this game, I think they're going to have to try to score a bunch of points on Jeff Hafley's defense. That's how confident I am with how things just lay out with what Jacksonville struggles with and how I think Green Bay can capitalize on it. yeah, there's just no other way to look at it. I think it's a massive week for the Packers air attack. It is Mitch. I am on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Appreciate all the support as we build this thing up. Sticking with the Jacksonville defense just to hammer this home. If none of that convinced you, I tried, right? I think it should kind of lure you into believing like, okay, Green Bay, the air attack should do pretty well this week against Jacksonville. Think about this if that didn't sway you. This is a Jacksonville defense that gave up 35 points to Caleb Williams. Now, the Bears' offense is starting to figure it out, but that was like, wow, this is the best Chicago's offense has looked all year type week. And that was 2 weeks ago against Jacksonville. The Bears scored 35 points against Jacksonville. Joe Flacco the week before scored 34 points. I love me some Joe Flacco. He seems like the ageless wonder. Like last year he was doing it in Cleveland, helped get them to the playoffs before throwing 2 pick sixes, I think against Houston, right out of the gates on Wild Card weekend. Now he was filling in for an injured Anthony Richardson. He put up 34 against Jacksonville. And then just this past week, Drake May, the rookie quarterback, and Drake May might end up being phenomenal. I don't know. I don't have a clue right now. But in his second ever NFL start across the pond in London, halfway across the country, I know New England lost to Jacksonville, but Drake May threw for 276 yards, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions. And in his first start the week prior, he had 2 picks. Didn't throw one against Jacksonville at 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. Drake May, even in defeat, had to be leaving that field in London feeling pretty good about his own performance. Quarterbacks have done very, very well as the point, as have offenses overall against this Jacksonville defense. So it's setting up to be a really, really good week for the Green Bay offense. On the flip side, I do think, I know it's the easy way out to just bring up the opposing quarterback each and every week. We try not to do that. But Trevor Lawrence is, if you bring up the statement, Trevor Lawrence is the guy, Trevor Lawrence is one of these guys at the quarterback position, I think it opens up Pandora's box for one hell of a case study. I still don't know what to make of Trevor Lawrence. I haven't watched Jacksonville nearly enough to like sit here and pound on the table with a really bold take one way or the other about Trevor Lawrence. I've only seen Jacksonville in 2 games this year, and they were in consecutive weeks in the London games just because they were early kickoffs, only game on before we get to the noon slate if you live in, of course, the Central Standard Time Zone. I will say, though, for someone who's making the second most amount of money annually at the quarterback position, Trevor Lawrence tied this year annually, and I don't like going into other pockets, but he's making the same amount as Joe Burrow and Jordan Love. And if you're making the same amount as those type of quarterbacks, your franchise, the owners, general manager, front office, coaching staff, your teammates, it raises the expectations. They're naturally going to expect more out of you. And with Trevor Lawrence, there seems to be a lot left to be desired. There seems to be a lot left on the plate in many of these games. And it's not just Lawrence, it's really with the offense. I'll be honest, I'm kind of surprised with how porous Jacksonville has been on offense at times because maybe I was just hypnotized by that Philadelphia stretch through the postseason where Doug Peterson was the head coach and Nick Foles, of all people, looked like the greatest thing since Kurt Warner in the greatest show on turf with Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt and Marshall Faulk. That Philadelphia offense, that one postseason when Carson Wentz went down in the regular season, they were an unstoppable machine. All the way into the Super Bowl in Minneapolis where they destroyed Tom Brady and the New England Patriots. And Doug Peterson had the balls to call that Philly special amongst many other things throughout that game. Like, I remember that stretch and thinking, Doug Peterson is a hell of a coach. And when he was let go by Philadelphia, I kept thinking, like, Philadelphia is just one of these franchises in one of these cities where coaches typically, I don't think, outside of that Andy Reid run, they just don't stick around too long because the expectations are always high regardless of what the head coach has to work with, whether it's the Phillies, the 76ers, to an extent, I guess, the Flyers, and certainly the Philadelphia Eagles. So I always thought, like, Doug Peterson, I think, is a really good coach, really good offensive mind. He's so creative. He's ballsy. He takes risk. And I thought it would be a really, really good match with him and Trevor Lawrence in Jacksonville. And maybe it still will be, but I got to imagine that seat's getting a little hot after an 0-4 start this season, and they're sitting at 2-5. And it's just, it's not working out. Because for Trevor Lawrence, like if you're the guy, you have to be able to elevate those around you regardless of the circumstances, if that makes sense. Like if you feel an abundant amount of confidence that you have pegged the guy at quarterback to be the face of the franchise for the next decade plus, you're talking about a quarterback that you trust to get the job done. Not always. I mean, that's impossible. But even when the deck is stacked against you. You like with Aaron Rodgers, there could have been a number of injuries, a defense for Green Bay that was horrible. And I always thought every single Sunday, Green Bay's got a shot. Why? Because they have Aaron Rodgers. And I know that's an extreme example because he's one of the all-time greats, but I always felt that with Aaron Rodgers. And it really, like one recent example, was it his last year in Green Bay or his second last season in Green Bay? There was like a Thursday night matchup in Arizona, and like every single receiver was out for Green Bay. They were down to the bare minimum at wideout. I think they called a couple guys up from the practice squad. It was a short week. They're playing Arizona, who was 7-0, I think, and Green Bay was like 5-2 or 6-1. And they went into Arizona. Rodgers got the job done. Rasul Douglas picked off K1 in the end zone on a play where A.J. Green wasn't really knowing what was going on. And it was one of those games where I was like, it is so true that as long as you have Aaron Rodgers, you have a shot. And that's how I look at other quarterbacks if I label them as the guy. And I don't think Trevor Lawrence is even close to that spot. And I mentioned some of the pitfalls with the defense this year. It might not always be a pretty picture for this Jacksonville offense, but if you're being paid as one of the highest paid quarterbacks, one of the highest paid players in league history, you just have to do better. And I know it might seem unfair to match the salary with the expectations of the performance on the field, but that's kind of the world we live in with sports. You have to meet the match. And I look at this Jacksonville offense. So far this year, they're 2-5. They scored 17 points against Miami, 13 against Cleveland, 10 against Buffalo, 16 against Chicago. I realize I named some pretty good defenses there, but you've played 7 games this year, and in 4 of them, you've scored 17 or less points. 17 is rarely going to get it done in the NFL. And so I think we'd be looking at this differently if Jacksonville was 2-5, but the offense was like a well-oiled machine with Peterson at the controls and Trevor Lawrence looking incredible at the quarterback position. For me, he hasn't been bad. I'd put him just at like good, like right around that average mark. But he's getting paid as someone who should be far, far more than that. And I do think there are decent pieces in place for Jacksonville that Green Bay certainly has to be aware of this weekend. Brian Thomas, the rookie wide receiver out of LSU, has really popped. Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis they're more than serviceable. Like, they're solid at the wide receiver position. There's a lot of quarterbacks working with a lot less. So Green Bay's defense can't stroll into this thinking like, wow, Jacksonville, that offense has been pretty underwhelming and they're just going to roll over for us. It's not going to be the case. That's not how a Doug Peterson-led team is going to go about things, certainly. And they still have their belief in Trevor Lawrence. And if I'm Jacksonville, even though Green Bay's defense to me has been spectacular under Jeff Hafley for the most part, if I'm Jacksonville, I would look at this game and say, hey, you know what? Offense was pretty damn good against New England last week in London. Let's start streaking this together, make it 2, 3, 4 weeks in a row where the offense is figuring it out. And so Jacksonville does come in with some confidence on the offensive side of the ball. But when you really look at the whole picture, Trevor Lawrence there's no way anyone in Jacksonville could say he's panned out to the extent that they thought he would to this point. And I would assume the leash is long because of the contract he has. But, man, I don't know. I thought they'd be in a much different spot, especially when they hired Doug Peterson to take over. And I do want to clarify again, like, this Green Bay defense has to still be worried. They have to be laser focused because Trevor Lawrence does have an immense amount of talent. He does have decent weapons to work with. Trevor Lawrence doesn't get a lot of the blame for the struggles, and he probably shouldn't. But at some point, I think we just pivot and accept him as a good quarterback instead of a franchise-changing quarterback. And so I think for him, it's a big opportunity this weekend to try to prove some of the doubters wrong, and one game isn't going to do that, but against a solid defense, he could open up some more eyes where people are like, wow, maybe Trevor Lawrence is finally turning a corner and can find that consistency on a week-in, week-out basis. I really like Green Bay's chances this week because of where Jacksonville's at right now. It's a team that, yes, they're coming off a win against a pretty lowly New England squad, but there's so many question marks on that defense, and they give up so many passing yards and so many points, and they don't take the ball away, and they don't get home to the quarterback. I'm not going to be surprised if this is like a Jordan Love game where he has 287 yards and 4 touchdowns against Jacksonville, and Green Bay's offense puts up like 31 or 34 points or something like that. I do think there's going to be that many opportunities to exploit the weaknesses in this Jacksonville's defense that plays right into the hands of Green Bay's offense. They seem focused. They beat Houston with, again, what to me was like a C-plus performance. Like, you're happy you got the win last week, but there's a lot to work on for Green Bay, and I think that's such a good spot to be in, where it's like, we're playing well enough to win, but man, there's a lot of room for improvement. Lost the turnover battle 3-0 last week and escaped against a 5-1 Houston team. Like, this isn't a team resting on its laurels coming into this game against Jacksonville. And under Matt LaFleur, this team really doesn't string together back-to-back sloppy outings. And although they got the W last week, it was a pretty sloppy outing. So we'll see what happens. This has been Green Bay, Jacksonville. Final thoughts. Mitch, I'm on YouTube. Please subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.